The wind came from the northwest that January, the way it always does on the northern Great Plains. Not as a gust, but as a wall. A sustained, relentless pressure that didn't howl so much as groan, pressing against every surface it touched as if testing for weakness. On the night of January 14th, 1948, the thermometer outside the Harlan County Agricultural Post read -19 degrees Fahrenheit, -28 degrees Celsius. By 2 in the morning, it had dropped another 4 degrees. Inside the cluster of homestead structures scattered along the low ridge above Dry Creek Flats, families were doing what families had done every brutal winter before this one, burning everything they could reach. Rolled blankets pressed against door gaps, coats worn to bed. Children pulled into the center of the room, away from the outer walls, where frost crept inward like slow fingers to the corrugated steel and thin board siding. 7 of the 9 families on that ridge were shivering. 2 were not. One of the 2 warm households that night was a Morrison Place, a solid sod and timber construction that had been standing since 1931, its thick earthen walls holding heat the way old things hold secrets. Quietly, stubbornly, without explanation, nobody was surprised that the Morrison cabin stayed warm. It always did. The other warm structure, however, was a different matter entirely. It sat at the eastern end of the ridge, a barrel-shaped silhouette against the black sky, ribbed like the hull of an overturned ship, its corrugated steel skin catching the moonlight in pale, stuttering gleams. A Quonset hut, military surplus. The kind of structure men in the settlement had privately agreed was a fool's shelter. Fine for storing equipment, maybe, but no place to raise children through a northern plains winter. The steel would conduct cold directly inward. The curved shape would trap no heat. Everyone knew this. And yet from that barrel-shaped roof, 2 columns of smoke rose and steady, unhurried streams into frozen dark, one from each end of the structure, curling upward and dissolving against the stars with the calm confidence of a well-fed fire. Inside the hut, a woman named Margaret Eloise Crandall was asleep. Her children, 9-year-old Dora and 6-year-old Caleb, were asleep beside her. The interior temperature, measured the following morning by a wall-mounted dairy thermometer, read 61 degrees Fahrenheit, 16 degrees Celsius. Outside, it was still -17 degrees Fahrenheit, -27 degrees Celsius. The differential between Margaret's sleeping quarters and the open air that night was 78 degrees Fahrenheit. Her nearest neighbor, Harold Vetch, who had laughed openly when she poured her first foundation stones back in October, spent that same night awake, feeding a stove every 90 minutes to keep his family from freezing. This is a story of what Margaret Crandall understood and how she understood it, before anyone else on that ridge was willing to listen. If you've ever wondered why some old structures stayed warmer than others, with less fuel, less effort, and less technology, stay with us. Like this video, subscribe, and drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. We're documenting the forgotten engineering of the American frontier, one story at a time. To understand what Margaret built, you have to understand what she was building into. Rewind to the spring of 1947. The high plains of south central Nebraska, Harlan County, just north of the Kansas line. We're in the middle of a slow, grinding recovery. The war had ended 2 years before, and the men and women filtering back into the rural interior of the country were doing so with less money than they'd hoped, more determination than they'd admitted, and a complicated surplus of military equipment suddenly available through federal programs at prices that seemed almost too good to be true. Among that surplus, the Quonset hut, originally designed in 1941 at the Quonset Point Naval Air Station in Rhode Island, hence the name. The structure had been mass-produced by the tens of thousands for military use across every theater of the war. It was a masterpiece of industrial pragmatism, a semicircular cross-section of corrugated steel ribs bolted together over a simple wooden base that could be assembled by unskilled labor in under a day. It required no foundation engineering, no specialized tools, no architect. A small crew with a wrench set and a level could raise a standard 20 by 48-foot Quonset in roughly 16 hours. For the military, this was a virtue. For a plains homesteader trying to put a roof over her family before the first frost, it was similarly appealing. Through the Federal Surplus Program, a standard Quonset hut kit could be acquired in 1946 and 1947 for between $400 and $800, depending on size and condition, a fraction of what a comparable frame structure would cost to build from scratch in that region, where lumber had to be hauled in from distances that made every board an investment. Margaret Crandall arrived in Harlan County in May of 1947 with $620 in cash, 2 children, a truckload of household goods, and a Quonset hut kit she had purchased through the surplus office in Hastings, Nebraska, the previous autumn. She was 34 years old. Her husband, Raymond Crandall, had died of a ruptured appendix in 1945, 2 months before the end of the war in the Pacific. He had never seen his son Caleb walk. She had chosen to plot on the ridge above Dry Creek Flats because of the tree line to the northwest, a broken band of cottonwood and elm that she calculated would interrupt the worst of prevailing winter wind before it reached her site. This was not a guess. She had spent 3 winters in a sod house in Dundee County, 40 miles to the west, and she had learned to read the land the way most people read a room, by watching where drafts came from. She arrived to a community of 9 families, mostly men who had been farming the area for between 5 and 20 years, along with their wives and children. Some were friendly. Several were curious. 1 or 2 were something closer to wary, in a particular way that experienced people sometimes become wary when someone new begins making decisions that contradict everything they believe they already know. Margaret unloaded her Quonset hut kit and spent 2 weeks studying the site before she drove a single stake into the ground. Before we follow Margaret to the moment she began building, it's worth pausing to understand exactly what was wrong with the standard Quonset hut as a winter shelter on the northern plains, because the problems were not minor, and the men who doubted her were not entirely wrong to doubt. A Quonset hut, in its unmodified military form, is thermally catastrophic in sustained cold. The corrugated steel shell that gives the structure its iconic curved profile is an excellent conductor of heat, which is precisely the last thing you want to shelter at minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 29 degrees Celsius. Steel has a thermal conductivity roughly 50 times greater than wood, and over 1,000 times greater than still air. In practical terms, this means that every British thermal unit of heat generated inside the hut is being actively pulled toward the cold metal surface, where it dissipates into the outside air almost immediately. The curved geometry, which has no flat ceiling to slow convective rise, compounds a problem. Warm air climbs immediately to the apex of the arch and presses against the coldest surface in the room, the steel roof, where it surrenders its heat and drops back down, cold, in a continuous convective loop that essentially turns the interior of the hut into a radiator cooling itself. Settlers who tried to live year-round in unmodified Quonset huts in Nebraska, South Dakota, and the Montana High Plains during the late 1940s reported burning between 2 and 3 full cords of firewood per month in winter, roughly 2 to 3 times what a well-constructed timber cabin of comparable size would require. Local account from that period described waking to frost on the interior walls, even with a fire burning through the night. Some families reported that the metal walls would ring in extreme cold, a low, deep resonance caused by thermal contraction of the steel ribs, a sound that settlers described in oral accounts preserved by the County Historical Society as deeply unsettling. The standard solution attempted by most settlers was insulation, tacking wool batting, old newspapers, cardboard, or burlap against the interior steel ribs to create a modest dead air barrier. This helped, but not enough. A 2-inch layer of newspaper batting might reduce heat loss by 20 to 30%, meaningful, but not transformative. The fundamental problem remained. The structure had no thermal mass. It could not store heat. The moment the fire died, the interior temperature began its collapse toward ambient, and it collapsed fast. This was the universally acknowledged reality of the Quonset hut as a winter shelter in 1947. No one in the Harlan County settlement believed it could be made genuinely warm without a level of modification that would cost more than simply building a proper cabin in the first place. No one, that is, except Margaret Crandall, who had spent 2 weeks walking her site, watching smoke from her campfire drift in the evening wind, and thinking about something she had seen in a sod house cellar 14 years before. Margaret Crandall was not a formally educated woman in the engineering sense. She had completed 8 years of schooling in Arapahoe, Nebraska, followed by 2 years of practical coursework at a county agriculture extension program, the kind of institution that in the 1930s taught young women canning, soil management, animal husbandry, and the basics of rural construction, because the alternative was learning by catastrophic failure. What she had, beyond that formal foundation, was observation. 3 winters in a sod house had given her something that no textbook could easily replicate: a physical, intuitive understanding of how heat moves through enclosed space. She had lived inside walls that were 2 feet thick. She had placed her hand on earthen surfaces that stayed warm to the touch 6 hours after the fire had gone out. She had slept in a structure where the temperature differential between floor and ceiling was less than 8 degrees, compared to the 15 to 20 degree stratification that plagued most conventional wood-frame cabins. She understood in her bones the difference between a shelter that makes heat and a shelter that holds it. And she had one other reference point, a detail she mentioned in a letter to her sister in Grand Island, preserved in the Harlan County Historical Archive, dated June 3, 1947. I remember the old Delaney place had their stove in the corner, and their flue ran along the wall all the way to the far end before it went up through the roof. That house was always the warmest on the road in February. I've been thinking about why. The Delaney place, as Margaret remembered it, had not been using a particularly large stove or an exceptional grade of firewood. What it had was a chimney path that ran horizontally through the living space before exhausting vertically. A long, slow route that forced the combustion gases to surrender as much of their residual heat as possible to surrounding masonry before escaping. Every foot of horizontal flue travel, with a foot of radiant heat, returned to the room rather than lost to the sky. She had also, during her site survey weeks, done something that struck the neighboring men as peculiar. She had lit small fires at various points around her building site and watched, carefully, repeatedly, how the smoke moved. She was mapping airflow, identifying where the prevailing northwest wind created pressure zones and low-pressure eddies around the site, determining, through direct observation rather than calculation, where a chimney opening would draw best and where it would backdraft. By mid-June, she had made 3 decisions that would define her entire thermal strategy. First, she would place not 1 but 2 heat sources inside the hut, 1 at each end of the structure. This would eliminate the single-point heating problem and allow warm air to be generated simultaneously at both the east and west terminations of barrel, creating a more even thermal distribution across the full length of the 48-foot interior. Second, between the 2 heat sources at the center of the hut, she would build a freestanding interior wall of local fieldstone, not a partition wall, but a thermal mass wall designed to absorb heat from both fires during the day and release it slowly through the night. Third, the chimneys would not run straight up to the roof. They would travel horizontally along the inner wall surface for a minimum of 6 feet before rising, exactly as she remembered from the Delaney place, extracting residual heat from the flue gases before they escaped. Her neighbors thought she was wasting her summer. Harold Vetch, who farmed the adjacent claim to the north, stopped by on a Tuesday afternoon in late June to watch her lay out her foundation stones. He stood for a while, arms crossed, watching her work. Then he said, loud enough for 2 other men nearby to hear, 2 chimneys. You know, that means twice the firewood. Margaret did not look up from her work. Only if you don't know where to put them, she said. The summer of 1947 was dry and long on the Harlan County Ridge, which suited Margaret's purposes exactly. She had until mid-October, roughly 16 weeks, before the first serious frost would arrive, and she intended to use every one of them. She began with the foundation, and she began with stone. The field stone she needed was not hard to find. The creek bed below the ridge had been depositing limestone and sandstone cobbles for centuries, sorted and rounded by seasonal flood water into pieces that ranged from fist size to the weight of a small child. Margaret hauled stone by the wheelbarrow load through June and into July, stacking it in rough piles near the building site. Local accounts suggest she moved somewhere between 3 and 4 tons of raw stone before she was satisfied, an estimate consistent with the dimensions of the thermal wall she would eventually build. The Quonset shell itself went up in 4 days with the help of her children and 2 neighboring families who, whatever their private doubts about the project, were not the kind of people to watch a widow assemble a steel structure alone. The standard 20 by 48-foot military kit bolted together cleanly on the wooden sill plates she had already set into a shallow gravel bed. By the end of July, the curved steel roof was in place. What happened next was where Margaret departed from every other Quonset installation on the ridge. Instead of positioning a single stove at the center of the structure, the conventional approach, she framed two separate firebox positions, one at each end wall, offset slightly from center toward the interior to allow for the horizontal flue run she had planned. Each firebox was built from the same creek bed limestone she had been hauling all summer, mortared with a lime and clay mix she had prepared herself. The fireboxes were modest in size, each with an interior firebox cavity of roughly 18 inches wide by 14 inches deep by 20 inches tall, designed not for dramatic combustion, but for slow, sustained burning of split hardwood. From each firebox, the flue did not rise immediately. Instead, Margaret ran the flue channel horizontally along the interior surface of the end wall for a minimum of 7 feet, 3 feet more than she had originally planned, after she observed how quickly the draft moved during her test fires, before bending it upward into the steel roof via a simple sheet metal collar she had fabricated from surplus material. The horizontal run was constructed entirely of stacked sandstone and limestone, laid in a channel roughly 8 inches square, sealed with clay mortar. Every inch of that horizontal run was a heat exchanger. The combustion gases traveling through it were still hot enough to warm the stone around them, and that stone, once warm, would radiate steadily into room for hours after the fire itself had burned down to coals. The thermal mass wall at the center of the structure was the final and most labor-intensive element. Margaret built it 4 feet high, 18 inches thick, and running the full 20-foot width of the hut's interior, a freestanding partition of dry-stacked and mortared fieldstone that divided the living space into 2 roughly equal zones. She did not intend it as a room divider in the conventional sense. She intended it as a battery. The logic was straightforward, though few of her neighbors recognized it as such at the time. A stone wall of those dimensions, approximately 4 feet high, 18 inches thick, 20 feet wide, represented a thermal mass of roughly 3,200 to 3,600 pounds of dense rock. Limestone and sandstone have a specific heat capacity of approximately 0.19 to 0.22 BTU per pound per degree Fahrenheit. This means that heating that wall by 40 degrees Fahrenheit, from a cool 55 degrees Fahrenheit to a warm 95 degrees Fahrenheit, would store somewhere between 24,000 and 31,000 BTU of thermal energy within it. A standard cord of split hardwood contains roughly 20 million BTU, which means even modest daily fires from both end stoves would charge the wall fully within a few hours of burning and keep it radiating warm to the coldest 16-hour nights. By the 1st of October, the structure was complete. Margaret moved her family in on October 9th, 2 weeks before the first hard frost settled over Harlan County. Harold Vetch stopped by again that afternoon, this time with 2 other men from the ridge, and stood at the open-end wall looking in at the stone partition running across the center of the hut. He was quiet for a long moment. "All that stone," he finally said, "is going to make the floor sink." Margaret handed him a cup of coffee and said nothing. It would be easy in retrospect to paint Margaret's neighbors as simple men incapable of recognizing a good idea. That would be unfair, and it would be inaccurate. The skepticism that greeted her double chimney design in the autumn of 1947 was not born from ignorance. It was born from hard experience, the kind that accumulates over years of watching things fail on the northern plains, where the margin between a good winter and a killing one was often no wider than a miscalculation in firewood supply or a structural decision made in summer that revealed its flaw in February. Harold Vetch had been farming the ridge since 1929. He had survived the Dust Bowl, 2 early freezes that destroyed winter wheat crops, and a winter in 1936 that killed 3 cattle and 2 neighbors in the same month. When he looked at Margaret's Quonset hut in the fall of 1947, he saw a steel shell, and he knew what steel shells did in cold. He had seen 2 other families attempt to winter in unmodified Quonset huts in the years just after the war, and both had abandoned the structures by December, migrating to relatives' homes or renting space in town until spring. His concern about the double chimney system was specific and, on the surface, reasonable. 2 fires require twice the wood. On the northern plains, where timber was not local and every cord had to be hauled in by truck from the eastern river bottoms at a cost that represented a meaningful fraction of a homestead family's annual cash, firewood was not an abstract resource. It was a survival calculation. A single woman with 2 children could not easily haul, split, and stack enough wood for 2 fires burning simultaneously through a 4-month winter. The math, as Vetch understood it, simply did not work. Eugene Picard, who had built 3 timber frame cabins on a ridge over the previous decade and considered himself the settlement's closest approximation of a professional builder, raised a different objection. The curved steel roof, he argued, would negate the benefit of any interior thermal mass. Heat rising from the stone wall would reach the apex of the arch and transfer directly through the steel skin to the outside air. The hut was, in his estimation, structurally incapable of retaining warmth regardless of what was built inside it, unless the entire interior surface was insulated, a project he estimated would cost more than the hut itself. A third neighbor, a quiet man named Dewey Farnsworth, who had spent 2 years as a pipe fitter before taking up farming, expressed concern about the horizontal flue runs. Horizontal flues, he pointed out, were prone to creosote accumulation, the tarry, combustible residue that builds up when wood smoke slows and cools before exiting a chimney. A creosote fire in a horizontal stone channel, he warned, could be nearly impossible to extinguish and could crack the mortar, compromise the flue, or fill the interior with smoke at the worst possible moment. These were not foolish objections. They were the objections of men who had paid close attention to the world they lived in, what they lacked, and what Margaret had was a reference point outside that world. Her 3 winters in the sod house had shown her something that no amount of experience with timber frame construction would reveal, that a structure built around thermal mass operated by a fundamentally different logic than a structure built around combustion output. In a conventional cabin, you needed a big fire because the heat left almost as fast as you made it. In a mass-heated structure, you needed a sustained fire, not a large one, because the goal was not to heat the air but to charge the walls, the floor, and the stone, which would then return that heat slowly over many hours. 2 modest fires burning 6 to 8 hours a day, she had calculated, would consume no more wood than 1 large fire burning continuously, and would distribute heat across the full length of the structure in a way that one central stove never could. She wrote in her journal that October, "They are arguing about the size of the bucket. I am thinking about the size of the well." By November, the arguments had settled into a tense, watchful silence. The settlement would let the winter decide. The winter of 1947 to 48 arrived early and stayed late across south-central Nebraska. The first measurable snowfall came on November 18th, earlier than average by nearly 3 weeks. By mid-December, the ridge above Dry Creek Flats had received 31 inches of accumulated snow, and the overnight lows were regularly dropping below 0 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 18 degrees Celsius. Margaret's daily routine had settled into a rhythm by then. She rose at 5 in the morning and fed both stoves, the east end firebox first, then the west, with split elm and cottonwood that she had stacked against the interior end walls and cords she had hauled before the first snow. Each morning, fire burned for 4 to 5 hours, bringing the stone wall at the center of the hut up to what she estimated, by touch and by the behavior of a small mercury thermometer she kept mounted to its surface, was somewhere between 85 degrees Fahrenheit and 95 degrees Fahrenheit, 29 degrees Celsius to 35 degrees Celsius. She banked both fires in the early afternoon, letting them drop to slow coals, and did not restoke them until evening, when she would bring them up again for 2 to 3 hours before the family went to sleep. The stone wall did the rest. On most nights, with both fires banked and the children asleep, the interior temperature of the hut held between 58 degrees Fahrenheit and 64 degrees Fahrenheit, 14 degrees Celsius to 18 degrees Celsius, until morning, a range that required no additional fuel and no one to tend the fire through the night. The horizontal flue runs, warmed to the touch for hours after each burn, added a steady peripheral radiation along both end walls. The curved steel ceiling, which Picard had predicted would bleed the heat away, was partially mitigated by a layer of burlap and straw batting Margaret had tacked the interior ribs, a low-cost insulation measure that reduced the convective loss at the apex without the full interior lining Picard had deemed necessary. The critical test came on the night of January 14th. A cold front descended from Canada with unusual speed and severity, dropping temperatures across the region by nearly 30 degrees Fahrenheit, 17 degrees Celsius, in less than 6 hours. By midnight, the official reading at the County Agricultural Post was minus 19 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 28 degrees Celsius. By 2 in the morning, it had reached minus 23 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 31 degrees Celsius, the lowest temperature recorded at that station since 1936. On the ridge, every household was in crisis mode. Harold Vetch burned through nearly a quarter cord of wood that single night, feeding his stove every 90 minutes to keep his family from retreating to the root cellar. His interior temperature, which he recorded the following morning in a notebook he kept for farming purposes, dropped to 31 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 0.5 degrees Celsius, near the outer walls, just above freezing, before he managed to bring it back up. Eugene Picard's timber frame cabin, the best conventional construction on the ridge, held at approximately 38 degrees Fahrenheit, 3 degrees Celsius, at its coldest point overnight. Margaret's hut, when she checked her dairy thermometer at 6 in the morning, read 51 degrees Fahrenheit, 10 degrees Celsius. She had not risen once to feed the fires. Both stoves had been banked at 9:30 the previous evening. The stone wall at the center of the hut, which she touched with her palm as she crossed to the east stove, was still warm. The temperature differential between her interior and the outside air at 6 that morning was 74 degrees Fahrenheit, 41 degrees Celsius. Compared to Vetch's cabin, her interior was 20 degrees Fahrenheit, 11 degrees Celsius warmer despite burning less wood that week, a figure she arrived at by comparing her consumption log against what Vetch later told her, with some reluctance, he had burned through the same period. Compared to Picard's cabin, her advantage was 13 degrees Fahrenheit, 7 degrees Celsius on the coldest night of the year, against the average of the remaining 6 households on the ridge, all of which had struggled through the night with varying degrees of distress. Her interior temperature advantage was approximately 48 degrees Fahrenheit, 27 degrees Celsius, when measured against the coldest recorded interior readings reported the following morning. 48 degrees. On a night when the difference between warm and cold was the difference between sleeping and survival, Dewey Farnsworth's concern about creosote accumulation in the horizontal flues proved partially valid. Margaret cleaned both horizontal channels twice that winter using a weighted brush she had fashioned from a corn cob and a length of wire, and she managed the burn temperature carefully to keep the flue gases hot enough to minimize condensation. It was an additional maintenance task, but a manageable one, and a small price for what the horizontal runs delivered in return. By the end of February, Margaret Crandall had burned 1.25 cords of wood to heat her family through the coldest winter on the ridge in 11 years. Harold Vetch, in his conventional cabin of comparable square footage, had burned 3 cords and 2/3. She had used less than half the fuel to maintain a warmer interior. The settlement had its answer. By the following October, autumn of 1948, 3 families on a Harlan County ridge had begun modifying their own structures with elements drawn directly from what they had watched Margaret build. The Farnsworth family, perhaps because Dewey had studied the flue design most carefully and understood its mechanics better than anyone else who had visited the site, was the first to act. He added a horizontal flue extension to his existing cabin stove. Not a full rebuild, but a 6-foot sandstone channel running along his north wall before the exhaust turned upward. He reported that his morning interior temperatures through the winter of 1948 to 49 were consistently 12 degrees Fahrenheit to 15 degrees Fahrenheit, 7 degrees Celsius to 8 degrees Celsius, higher than the previous year, with no measurable increase in wood consumption. The Morrison family, already warm in their old sod construction, added a modest interior stone partition as a room divider between their kitchen and sleeping area, not for structural reasons, but because Odo and Morrison had finally understood, watching Margaret's wall through 2 seasons, what thermal mass actually meant in practice. He told his wife, according to an account preserved in the County Historical Society's oral history collection, that it was like having a second stove that didn't need feeding. Eugene Picard never modified his cabin, but he also never again publicly criticized the double chimney design, and when a young couple named Aldrich arrived in the county in 1950 asking about winter construction, Picard directed them, without elaboration, to go speak with a woman at the east end of the Dry Creek Ridge. Margaret Crandall lived in that Quonset hut until 1961, when her daughter Dora married and the family consolidated onto a larger property further east. A brief notation in the Harlan County Agricultural Extension Bulletin for 1952, a practical, unromantic document concerned primarily with crop yields and soil conditions, includes a short passage on residential heating efficiency that references, without naming her, the double chimney thermal mass approach used by a homesteader on the Dry Creek Ridge. The bulletin described the technique as producing measurably superior interior temperature retention in metal shell structures during extreme cold events and recommends it for consideration by other settlers in similar situations. It was the closest thing to an official validation she ever received. What Margaret Crandall had done in the summer and autumn of 1947 was not magic, and it was not genius in the dramatic sense. It was the application of principles that had been understood in various forms, in various cultures, for centuries before she was born. The Roman hypocaust system, which ran heated air beneath stone floors to warm entire bathhouses, operated on the same logic of thermal mass and slow release. The Russian masonry stove, the pechka, which could heat a peasant home through a Siberian night on a single 2-hour burn, was built around the same understanding of stone as a heat battery. The Korean Ondal floor heating system, centuries old by the time Margaret was laying fieldstone in Nebraska, used the same principle of routing combustion gases through horizontal channels beneath a dense, heat-retaining surface before exhausting them outside. She had not invented anything. She had remembered something. Or more precisely, she had paid attention to something that experience had taught her and that the prevailing assumptions of her community had caused everyone else to overlook in a world that equated heat with fire. More fire, bigger fire, fire burning longer. She had understood that the relationship between combustion and warmth was not direct. It was mediated by mass, by density, by the slow, patient physics of materials that absorbed energy and released it on their own terms, indifferent to the cold outside. The Quonset hut that everyone agreed was unlivable in winter stayed warm through the coldest recorded night in 11 years on a ridge in south central Nebraska because a woman hauled creek stone by the wheelbarrow for 2 months and thought carefully about where to put 2 chimneys. The men who had doubted her were not stupid. They were simply reasoning from the wrong model. That gap between the model everyone assumes and the reality that careful observation reveals is where most of the forgotten engineering of the American frontier lived, in root cellars designed to exploit geothermal stability, in corner stoves positioned to exploit convective circulation, in sod walls 2 feet thick that laughed at February, in Quonset huts with 2 chimneys and a stone wall at the center that nobody thought would work until the thermometer read -23, and the answer was written in warm air and cold ash. Margaret Crandall's hut stood on that ridge for over a decade. The thermal mass wall she built is likely still there, somewhere beneath whatever replaced the structure, a quiet archive of fieldstone and lime mortar that once kept 2 children warm through the worst night of the year. Some engineering doesn't need a patent. It just needs someone willing to haul the stone. If this story made you think differently about heat, mass, and the quiet intelligence of people who built things to last, like this video, subscribe, and leave a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from, and tell us what forgotten technique you'd like us to uncover next. There are hundreds more stories like Margaret's out there, waiting in county bulletins, oral histories, and the foundations of structures that outlasted everything built around them. We'll keep digging. See you in the next one. Educational and historical content. This script is a dramatic reconstruction based on plausible historical conditions and vernacular engineering principles of the era. Character names, specific dialogue, and interior temperature readings are reconstructed for narrative purposes. It does not substitute for professional engineering or construction guidance.